The name Booker T. Washington is one that commands great respect and admiration, especially among African Americans and their white neighbors who witnessed Washington's novel achievements. Among his contemporaries, perhaps, the most astonishing qualities of the man were his strong will to pursue a cause and his ability to harvest the support of society's influential folks towards the same cause. Because of his influential leadership, the time span of his activity from 1880 to 1915 has been called the Age of Booker T. Washington. Born into slavery in a highly segregated society where racism, white domination, and anti-black violence were the order of the day, the boy Booker struggled through it all to found the Tuskegee Institute, one of the finest educational establishments in Southern America. Booker was raised in Tuskegee, Alabama, the smallest county seat of the state at the time. The town had about 2,000 inhabitants, most of whom were uneducated black people. Washington would later become a smart and passionate young man who created a chain of events that would affect not just blacks, but whites across America. From 1881 to 1915, Washington achieved what many had considered impossible. Plus, his name was at the center of many heated political conversations during his time. Booker T. Washington was an educator and reformer, the first president and pioneer developer of Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, now Tuskegee University, and the most influential spokesman for Black Americans between 1895 and 1915. Washington rose to prominence as an educator and activist, dedicating his life to the advancement of Black Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Early life and education. At the beginning of the American Civil War, about 4 million black people were living in slavery in America. Booker Taliaferro Washington was one of them. Booker grew up in the hostile racial climate of the South, where the society was racially, politically, and economically divided. He was born a slave in Hale Fords, Virginia, to a white man who refused to acknowledge him as his son, and a slave woman, Jane, who later married another slave. Booker's father played no role whatsoever in his life, and his mother struggled with the harsh realities of slavery while she worked on the James Burroughs plantation in Southwest Virginia. It was said that Booker never knew the day, month, or year he was born, but it was later reported that he was born on April 5, 1856. His mother had other children, but they had a rough life. When Booker turned 9, he and his family in Virginia finally gained freedom under the Emancipation Proclamation. When the U.S. troops occupied their region, they were declared free in 1865. Recounting the events on Emancipation Day, Booker said, "Some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation. I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see." After emancipation, his mother took the entire family to the free state of West Virginia to join her husband, Washington Ferguson, who had escaped from slavery during the war and settled there. Booker was enrolled in a local school where he picked a peculiar interest in books. The boy loved books. In fact, he also began teaching himself to read for the first time. At school, Booker took the family name of Washington after his stepfather. And when he learned that his mother had originally given him the name Booker Taliaferro when he was born, he immediately readopted it as his own and became known as Booker Taliaferro Washington for the rest of his life. Booker would later attend the Hampton Institute, a school established in Virginia to educate freemen and their descendants in vocational training and practical skills. He worked in salt furnaces and coal mines in West Virginia for several years to earn money and pay for his studies. He later attended Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. in 1878. He went back home to West Virginia after graduation, did some teaching, and even dabbled into politics. Brigadier General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder and president of the Hampton Institute, saw the potential of the young man and brought him back to the institute in 1879. He put Booker in charge of the Indian students. It was under Armstrong that Booker developed his ideas on industrial education. Speaking of Washington's performance in the role, Armstrong said he did a fine job indeed. Tuskegee Institute. The Tuskegee Institute was Washington's biggest legacy. For about 34 years while he led and directed the affairs of the school, it expanded to accommodate thousands of black students who graduated from the school to become leaders in society. In 1881, Samuel C. Armstrong recommended Washington, then barely 25, to become the first leader and principal of Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, later Tuskegee Institute, and now Tuskegee University, a new school for African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama. Despite the obstacles and challenges that confronted him while setting up the school, Washington maintained a passionate optimism about the future of the school that many at the time found hard to accept. The new school opened on July 4, 1881, initially using a room donated by Butler Chapel AME Zion Church. The next year, Washington purchased a former plantation to be developed as the permanent site of the campus. He'd managed to secure funding to buy 100 acres of land for the new school from very rich and influential white supporters, especially General James Marshall, who was a good friend of General Armstrong. And under Booker's direction, his students literally built the school with their own hands. They made bricks and constructed classrooms, barns, and outbuildings. He trained the students to become masters in growing their own crops and raising livestock, both for learning and to cater to their basic needs. True to the tenets of the schools, both men and women had to learn trades alongside academics. The institute focused a great deal on teaching the students the skills they needed to take back to their rural black communities throughout the South. Washington's goal was not to produce farmers and tradesmen, but experts in these fields who could teach black students in other communities and schools across the South. Interestingly, this strategy worked exceedingly well, as many black students benefited from the school, and Tuskegee started attracting massive national recognition. The school expanded over the decades, adding more programs and departments to become the present-day Tuskegee University. But as Washington's influence grew, hatred from white supremacists grew as well. Influence across African American society. As Booker developed Tuskegee, recruiting renowned teachers such as George Washington Carver and adding to both the curriculum and facilities, he became a prominent national leader among African Americans. But his influence didn't stop there. He had considerable influence among wealthy white philanthropists and politicians at the time. This allowed him to master the politics of the day, winning top influential people to his side and even attracting fierce opposition from some people in the African American community. Washington expressed his passionate vision for the advancement of the black race through the school. He believed black people should stay outside of American politics and all the agitations. Instead, he advocated for black education, insisting that African Americans needed to acquire important skills that would enable them to play their part as responsible and educated members of society, leading to acceptance by white Americans. He believed industrial education was the best way to gain full recognition and participation in society as Afro-American citizens. On September 18, 1895, he delivered the famous speech, which would later be known as the Atlanta Address of 1895. The speech brought him national prominence, attracting the attention of politicians and other influential members of the public. In that speech, Washington told his audience that the way forward for African Americans was self-improvement through an attempt to dignify and glorify common labor. He became a popular spokesperson for African American citizens and even appeared in numerous fundraiser speeches for the Tuskegee Institute. Booker built a nationwide network of supporters in many black communities, with black ministers, educators, and businessmen composing his core supporters. Booker T. Washington played a dominant role in black politics, winning wide support in black communities, mostly in the South, and among liberal whites in rich northern states. He gained access to top national leaders in politics, philanthropy, and education. Washington cooperated with many white people and enlisted the support of wealthy philanthropists. One of the prominent concerns about his friendship with white people was regarding the continued contributions he was getting from the Carnegies, the Baldwins, and the Rockefellers, which allowed Tuskegee to expand and prosper. His critics would claim that by his dependence on these financiers, Washington had become their unwitting tool and was forced to align himself with interests that may not necessarily represent the best interest of the country's blacks. But in the absence of proof to substantiate these claims, Tuskegee continued to blossom. The interesting thing about Washington's ideas is that he wasn't directly interested in challenging white supremacists or the segregational policies of the government. Instead, he focused on getting blacks to demonstrate industry, thrift, intelligence, and property. through education as the best way to gain equal social rights. Washington had an iron will and a strong sense of discipline, a combination that helped him to forge through suppressive forces and obstacles. He developed a relationship with Long Island Railroad President Mr. William Henry Baldwin Jr. and Jewish philanthropist and owner of Sears Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald. Based on his wide influence, nearly 5,000 new small rural schools based on his philosophy were built for black students throughout the South, although most were after his death. During his lifetime, Washington was the most dominant elite figure of the African American community, most of whom were overwhelmingly based in the South. He built a nationwide network of supporters, including black educators, ministers, editors, and businessmen who supported his views on social and educational issues for blacks. He appeared at several fundraisers and raised large sums of money for his cause. Booker was awarded honorary degrees from Harvard University in 1896 and Dartmouth College in 1901. His autobiography, Up from Slavery, gained nationwide recognition, also contributing to Washington's success. But one particular close ally and force that had stood by Washington was his private secretary, Emmett J. Scott, a former journalist. Scott had a major role in the management of the college, fundraising, and building Washington's national networks of black businessmen and white philanthropists. He was in fact referred to as W.E.B. Du Bois, as the Infernal Tuskegee Machine. He served Washington with dedication and a measure of ruthlessness. Atlanta Compromise, formation of NAACP, and rift with W.E.B. Du Bois. As Washington's influence and philosophy grew, he fell out with some highly educated blacks in the North. Most prominent among them was W.E.B. Du Bois, an American sociologist, socialist, historian, and Pan-Africanist civil rights activist. Du Bois was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1909. In the first few years of the new century, Du Bois became a spokesperson for the black race, ceded only to Booker T. Washington. Washington's Atlanta Address of 1895 was viewed as a revolutionary moment by both African Americans and whites across the country. W.E.B. Du Bois initially supported him, but later resented what Washington's ideas meant for the black community. The two men grew apart as Du Bois felt Washington was too accommodationist and passive toward white supremacists. Du Bois wanted to actively remedy the disenfranchisement of blacks and preached equal voting, social rights, and educational opportunities for blacks. After their falling out, Du Bois and his supporters referred to Washington's speech as the Atlanta Compromise to express their criticism that Washington was too accommodating to white interest. Atlanta Compromise was essentially an unwritten deal that Washington had struck in 1895 with Southern white leaders who dominated state governments after the Reconstruction. The deal provided that Southern blacks would submit to discrimination, racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and non-unionized employment, and that Southern whites would permit blacks to receive a basic education, some economic opportunities, and justice within the legal system. The agreement also included that Northern whites would invest in Southern enterprises and fund black educational charities. Du Bois respected Washington but felt that African Americans should fight for equal rights and higher opportunities rather than passively submit to segregation and discrimination. Du Bois' activism was also fueled by the lynching of Sam Hose near Atlanta in 1899. Hose was tortured, burned, and hanged by a mob of 2,000 whites. They even had Hose's burned knuckles on display in a storefront. He later became the leader of the Niagara Movement, a group of African American activists who wanted equal rights for blacks. Many other African Americans, including Archibald H. Grimke, Kelly Miller, James Weldon Johnson, and Paul Lawrence Dunbar, an elite group of blacks that Du Bois called the Talented Tenth. In fact, many blacks in the North objected to being led and authoritatively spoken for by a Southern accommodationist strategy, which they considered to have been imposed on Southern blacks by Southern whites. In the words of American historian and Professor Clarence Earl Walker to white Southerners, free black people were matter of place. Their emancipation was an affront to Southern white freedom. Booker T. Washington did not understand that his program was perceived as subversive of a natural order in which black people were to remain forever subordinate or unfree. From 1890 to 1908, after the departure of federal troops, Southern states disenfranchised most blacks and many poor whites through constitutional amendments and statutes that created barriers to voter registration and voting. Despite his open accommodation of black suppression, Washington privately contributed large sums to legal challenges to segregation and disenfranchisement, such as the case of Gills v. Harris, heard before the United States Supreme Court in 1903. But it was like going in circles because soon after these cases were won, Southern states quickly responded with new laws that often countered the judgment. The Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante groups continued flogging and lynching blacks and Indians in Southern communities. Not too long after fiercely resisting the opposition of the Niagara Movement, black activists in the North, led by Du Bois, later set up the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. They tried with limited success to challenge Washington's political machine for leadership in the black community. Northern critics called Washington's widespread and powerful organization the Tuskegee Machine. Later, between the 1920s and 60s, critics affiliated with the NAACP ridiculed the Tuskegee Institute as a producer of a class of submissive black laborers. However, since the late 20th century, historians have praised the achievements of Washington, especially the progressive black movements, institutions, and leaders in education, politics, architecture, and medicine that Tuskegee produced. Du Bois himself later regretted being so critical of Washington in some of his articles. Invitation to the White House. Because of his national influence, Booker T. Washington was an advisor to several presidents of the United States. In 1901, Booker T. Washington became the first African American to be invited to the White House when President Theodore Roosevelt invited him to dine with him. This event caused a huge uproar among white Americans, especially in the Jim Crow South and the press. But President Roosevelt saw Washington as a brilliant advisor on racial matters. His successor, President William Howard Taft, continued this practice. President Theodore Roosevelt eventually visited Tuskegee Institute on October 24, 1905. It was a turning point in the lives of all Southern blacks. It was the first time an American president would visit Tuskegee, Alabama, and it served to seal Washington's influence as the most powerful black political broker of his time. As you'd guess, not many people like this, but the Tuskegee Institute prospered anyways. The Oaks. The Oaks was the official lodge built for Washington on the campus ground. It was a unique masterpiece designed and built by one of the students of the Institute, Robert Robinson Taylor. Washington and his family moved into the house in 1900, and he lived there until his death. Washington was married 3 times. In his autobiography, Up from Slavery, he gave all 3 of his wives credit for their contributions at Tuskegee. His first wife, Fanny N. Smith, was from Malden, West Virginia. Smith was a student of his when he taught in Malden. He helped her gain entrance into the Hampton Institute. Washington married Smith in the summer of 1882. They had 1 child, Portia M. Washington, born in 1883. Fanny died in May 1884. In the following year, 1885, Washington married again to Olivia A. Davidson, a Virginia freeborn of a free black woman and her father who had been freed from slavery. Davidson studied at Hampton Institute too, and later went north to study at the Massachusetts State Normal School at Framingham. She taught in Mississippi and Tennessee before going to Tuskegee to work as a teacher. Washington recruited Davidson to Tuskegee and promoted her to vice principal. They had 2 sons, Booker T. Washington Jr. and Ernest Davidson Washington, before she died in 1889. Finally, on October 3, 1892, Washington married his last wife, Margaret James Murray. Murray was from Mississippi and had graduated from Fisk University, a historically black college. They had no children together, but she helped rear Washington's 3 children. Washington was so impressed by Margaret's work at the Institute that he selected her as the lady principal. In fact, she became his representative whenever he was away for a long time. But this time, Margaret Murray outlived Washington and died in 1925. Washington and his family were properly provided for by his friend Andrew Carnegie, and he had to give up his salary at the Institute. Death, honor, and memorials. Washington had a rigorous schedule for the most part of his life, and it took a toll on his health in later years. As the 19th century faded into history, the Tuskegee Star reached his zenith. Through his endless fundraising activities, Washington managed to swell the coffers of the Institute. Despite the raging controversies confronting him, Tuskegee thrived under his leadership. His health began to deteriorate rapidly in 1913. In 1915, he collapsed in New York City while on a fundraising tour. Washington was diagnosed by 2 different doctors as having Bright's disease, an inflammation of the kidneys, today called nephritis. When he was told that he had only a few days left to live, but there was a chance to save him if he stayed in New York, Washington insisted he preferred to die at Tuskegee. He survived the arduous train ride back home, but on the morning of November 14, 1915, he passed away peacefully at the age of 59. He's buried in the campus cemetery, now Tuskegee University Campus Cemetery. His funeral was held on November 17, 1915, in the Tuskegee Institute Chapel. It was attended by nearly 10,000 people, with memorial services held across America. Booker, the 1984 film about Booker T. Washington, is a historical drama that portrays the life and legacy of this influential African-American leader. By his death in 1915, Tuskegee had established more than 100 well-equipped buildings, 200 faculty members teaching 38 trades and professions, with roughly 1,500 students and an endowment of about $2 million. Throughout the history of Afro-America, Washington's influence could be found almost everywhere. For his contributions to American society, Washington was awarded an honorary master's degree from Harvard University in 1896, followed by an honorary doctorate from Dartmouth College. The Booker T. Washington Monument was dedicated in 1922 at the center of Tuskegee University. On April 7, 1940, Washington became the first African American to be depicted on a United States postage stamp. In 1942, the Liberty ship Booker T. Washington was named in his honor, the first major ocean-going vessel to be named after an African American. In 1946, he was honored on the first coin to feature an African American, the Booker T. Washington Memorial $half, which was minted by the United States until 1951. On April 5, 1956, the house where he was born in Franklin County, Virginia, was designated as the Booker T. Washington National Monument. Several high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools across the United States have been named after Booker T. Washington. Make sure to like this video if you enjoyed and subscribe for more content just like this. We'll see you in the next one.